Okay, so if you can see the Moodle screen, you'll notice that I've added in a place right under where the midterm exam is, where it says case instructions, case Dropbox. I've also added in the final exam Dropbox, but you don't have obviously the files just yet because those are going to be released, which we'll talk about today as well. First of all, does anyone have any questions about anything to date before we get into the case? If so, you could type them in the chat or you can unmute. Okay, not seeing any questions. Okay, so the case instructions, you can all download that. I'm going to share it with you in a moment. But for the case Dropbox, it is exactly the same as the midterm exam Dropbox. So you could put your files in there, and the due date, I think if I go into here, it should show you that when the due date is going to be, which is Friday, August 5th at 11:55. Oh, I'm going to change that. I meant to put it at 11:55 p.m. So I'm going to update that for you, but that's in the case document as well. Sometimes AM and PM gets mixed up. For when we do the final exam, it'll be AM, of course, because it's due on Monday, August 15th. So that one is going to be AM. So you'll see that there. If I go into this Dropbox, that one does say Monday, August 15th at 11:55 AM. So if you forget the times, you can come in here and look at that just to see where the due dates are. I see something in the chat. Oh, confirmed. So anyway, so the case instructions, if you open them up here, can everyone see my screen? Now, can you see the case instructions instead? Yes, perfect. Sometimes it works where it shows something different, other times it does not. So in terms of how the case is going to work, it's all detailed out in here, and you're going to do it in Citrix just like you always do. But what the first part of the case is going to be setting up a brand new company. So when you're reviewing how to do this, what I would recommend doing is looking at your textbook if you forget any of the components. So the case is considered to be part of your final course assessment. So that's the first comment. So there's going to be no check figures for it. And it's your responsibility to determine how to use the software properly by referencing the textbook. So the instructor is limited in the nature of responses about the content of the case, but you are allowed to consult your classmates as you proceed, but of course you have to submit your own work. Now, the way we can do this is that on Wednesday, I will set up the Zoom call and come online more for you guys to discuss with each other. If you have questions about how you're setting things up, you guys can compare, because again, this is a case, so you're allowed to do that. So hopefully that'll help you guys. If you guys want to talk about things, you can do so. Or if you just have general questions about the software and you can't find something, the textbook, I talked about this for the midterm using the index. If you use the index in the SAGE textbook, it'll sometimes help you figure out where to do certain things. But the other thing I wanted to mention about the case, and I guess specifically, is if you recall the textbook, when you were first setting up a company, you did a lot of that in Chapter 7. So Chapter 7 will be a good resource for you for many of the components of the case, but not everything, because I'm going to show you more parts of the case as we go here. But basically, what you're going to do is you're going to set up in Citrix under A for Marks, the case folder. And then you're going to have to do some specific things in the file that you set up in Sage. So, and all the details are in this document. So I'm just kind of going through it to remind you of stuff. But if you print this out, you could check off things as you do them. That's what I recommend to people to do, just because if you forget one thing, it can cause you a lot of mark deductions. So I would actually go through this and just print. If it tells you to do something specific, then you would want to make sure you do it. And so one of the things we do to make sure everyone's doing their own file is that for your form, you have to add the last 3 digits of your ID to the beginning of form numbers. And so, for example, if your ID was this one here, 20012598, and the next sales invoice number was 621, you would use 598, which are those last 3 digits here, and then add those to the beginning of the form number. So does anyone have questions on this part on the numbering? Okay, seeing no questions come up. So just make sure again that you follow that. And it does say that the penalties of not doing this would be 30% of your case grade. So how we're doing the case. So the part one is the whole company setup. And you'll see if I just scroll through here, there's 10 pages. So it's quite a lot of setup. And that is going to be due, as I already mentioned, in the beginning of the, well, you'll see that on Moodle, that will be due on the date that we showed there. So for each part of this, what we're going to do, the company setup is part one. And then for your final exam, you're actually going to be taking this case file and using it to actually record transactions. So if you think of how your midterm was, where you had an actual, I guess I'll call it a case, it's not really, but it's basically using the software. So your midterm, you had a company file where you went in and you did certain transactions. Well, the final exam is going to be similar, but the difference is you're going to be using this case that you created, this particular company, and doing transactions. Now, the transactions aren't released because that's the final exam. So in this case, this whole file right here is all of the actual setup of the company. So you are doing reports, and it talks about this. Ensure you have the correct CAD file and PDF files in the proper folder. And that's a whole bunch of detail on what happens if you don't do it. Another note I wanted to just highlight to you on here is that when you're doing your submission for the case, your histories have to be open. And you might remember this from chapter 7. It told you to have your histories open at one point, but then later on, when you're getting into the final exam, which we talk about here, you would basically, what you do is once you've submitted part one, so the case is finished, you back your file up again, and then plan to close your histories before proceeding into part two, which is the final exam. And it says you could close your histories at any time during your work on part two. It doesn't need to be closed immediately, but likely you'd have to do it before paying employees in the final exam. So what I would just recommend doing is once you submit your case, the final exam will be available to you, that you could just basically have that final exam. And I have it at the end of this document as well to tell you to just put it in your final exam folder, because you could start work on it at that time. So in terms of the structure, as I said, the case is due Friday, August 5th at 11:55 p.m. And I have to just update that in the Dropbox because I accidentally put a.m. And then the final exam is due Monday, August 15th at 11:55 a.m. And that is all the transactions, just like it was on the midterm, except we have a little bit of extra transactions. I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm in a weird screen. There we go. So basically in the case, you have a whole bunch of information about the company, talks about the case setup, talks about making sure the company name has your name in it as well, and then a whole bunch of different things. So there's just basically the whole chart of accounts here, talks about hints for preventing loss of your work, backup regularly, copy backup files to at least 2 separate places, do not back over existing backup files because then you couldn't go back to them. You might have to start from the scratch. So basically, for example, if you were doing a backup case to mid-page 3 account, backup file 2, case to end of page 5. So you basically just back up exactly where you're finished a page, so you know if you needed to start over, if it got corrupted or something like that, you would know where you're going. Another note in the case on page 3 says appropriate account types are expected. So if you had seen, if you remember from chapter 7, we always want to check our account setup as we go to make sure everything is correct. So we have a heading, like for example, here's the current assets, and then we have a total current assets, and then we have inventory and so on. So basically, for equity 2, you're using your name here again, just like we did in prior situations. And the difference, of course, from chapter 7, where you did the setup, is this has a lot of extra elements that we learned after chapter 7. So you'll see here adding foreign currency, right? So we didn't do that, obviously, in chapter 7, but we're doing it here. And then editing account classes, setting up credit cards, sales tax and tax codes. So basically, it's sort of a summary of everything we've learned in the textbook that you needed to know for the exam. So those other optional chapters, of course, aren't in the case either. So here's the opening account balances that you would be entering after you've set up your trial balance. So they have actual transactions that you'd be entering, or actual balances that you'd be entering in the account. Then there's one journal entry to do right here that shows you. And then once you're done all that, you can see it has little steps, sort of sub-steps, like step 10 says, create a new folder, export the following 2 reports. So journal entries all, and then a trial balance, okay? And then you would enter ledger settings. It kind of has a whole bunch more things. Here's the payroll setup, which keeps going for quite some time. And then supplier accounts, which is here on page 7. And then it talks about once you've set up all your suppliers, you're gonna, on number 13, export a supplier age detail report. So again, make sure every single report that you do is saved as PDF. So if you have to export to PDF or save as PDF. So, it says, I see the question, Ryan, will the case study be marked before we do the final exam so we know if the starting figures are correct going in? The thing is we don't necessarily give you your marks back before the exam, but you won't be marked on your correct balances. You'll be marked on the entries themselves. So, because even if you, let's say your balances were correct, if you did 2 transactions wrong, your closing isn't correct. So when I'm marking, like when I marked your midterm, for example, if you, let's say, Ryan, since you asked the question, let's say you had a totally correct balance sheet and income statement, then I don't even need to go into your journal entries, really. I will look at the report to make sure that the dates and descriptions make sense and things like that, and that the report was submitted correctly, but I don't have to go one by one into any of your entries because you had perfect balances in everything, right? However, if you didn't, let's say one balance is wrong, I don't know what mistake you made. I go through every single journal entry and mark it separately. So the case itself here with all the setup, you'll be marked on making sure things are correct. And there is a marking key I use to do that. And then for the exam, you'll be marked on all of your transactions. So I'm glad you asked that question because that's a really good question. Now, the other thing I did want to mention though, let's say there are some things, if you do them wrong, there might be a huge problem. Like let's say you, I don't know the age. Let's say, for example, you submit your case and for whatever reason, I hope this doesn't happen to anyone, you didn't do payroll. You didn't have time to even set up the whole payroll, but you just went ahead and submitted the case anyway. Well, then before you do the final exam, you need to make sure you go in and put payroll, even if it's after the deadline, so that you could actually do payroll in the final exam. So hopefully that makes sense. And once you do submit, so the submission deadline is August 5th, right? If at that point you're like, oh, I'm not really sure if I did this right. Obviously, you can't edit it or anything for your submission of the case. But if you wanted to ask me at that time, like we will have a class on Monday, if you want to say, like, I'm not sure I did this right, can we go through it and check? Then we can do it at that time because you've already submitted, that will be already marked. And then you could fix up your file before you start the final exam. So that's, I wouldn't do that. I don't think any of you really need to do that for most things, but if there is something you're really struggling with and you did it the best you could, certainly you could ask questions about it if you are kind of concerned that there is a big problem with your software that's going to make the final exam really hard to do. For example, like let's say you didn't, again, this wouldn't, I'll use the midterm as an example because I can't really think in this case how it would affect the transactions just yet. But in the midterm, if you forgot to set up a new inventory item that was purchased, you wouldn't be able to sell it. So that's a good example of if you did something where you didn't do something in the setup at all, then you might not be able to do the transaction at all. So that's where, again, if something happened where, I don't know. So anyway, the final exam is basically you have to finish the case before you could do the final exam. So any other questions about that? Hopefully that helps with that. So now I'll just keep going through. So you can kind of see that there's a whole bunch of things you save as you go, and you would just put them in your Citrix folder called case, right? Case part 1. And then we keep going. Here's the customer accounts, right? So it talks about the credit limit for the customers and the terms and the tax codes and individual customers. Here's all the employee information here that you're entering. Keep going. The next thing here, it says, enter in the employee summary report for both employees, right? And then has a few more things. And then it says it's suggested you stop and back up now, right? So, up to item 18, which is setting up the job categories. Then here's the inventory accounts that I talked about, which is on page 10 here. So that's kind of the last piece that you're doing is inventory. Then it tells you under step 20, into your case part 1, export inventory and service group list. That's the end of the setup. Do not close your histories yet. Import your backup file as case your last name, first name. Now it says if you've completed all prior steps, your case part 1 folder should contain all the following. So all these PDF reports, so journal entries, trial balance, supplier list, employee summary, and inventory list, and your backup folder backup of Sage, sorry. Now, once you've ensured all 6 files are present, all of these 6 right here, I should have numbered these instead of A, B, C, D, E, F, but there's 6 things here. So again, this is similar to the midterm where you had 6, well, I think you had however many number of items you had. So in this case, you have 6 things. You would then zip your case folder and upload that one zipped folder into the Moodle Dropbox created for this purpose, which I already showed you that said case Dropbox. And then I made a note here, ensure you keep a copy of your working file as you'll be using this for your final exam. So the final exam is going to be released next week on Wednesday, which gives you over a week to complete it. But of course, don't start until after you submit the case, which is due Friday, August 5th. So for some of you, you could start working on the case right now. You might finish it by next week and submit it early. It's due Friday, but if you finish it by Wednesday or even by Monday, you can submit it whenever you're finished. It doesn't matter. And at that point, as soon as you submit, it means you can ask me questions. So if you finish early and you submit, then as soon as the final exam is released, which is on Wednesday, then you can start that. So it's basically kind of like a take-home exam. And the reason I did it this way instead of like the midterm, you only had that one day to do it. The reason I'm giving you more time for this one is that if something went wrong in your case submission and you have a problem with it and you need to ask, trying to do that in just a 4-hour period doesn't make sense. So because we're trying to test your use of the software anyway, you will have, depending, I mean, you'll have at least from Friday, August 5th after you submit until August 15th to complete your final exam. But if you complete the case sooner, obviously you could start a bit earlier. Does anyone have questions on that? Everyone's so quiet today. Okay, so maybe what I'll do then is I don't have anything else to cover on the case because I think we went through it. And you're already familiar with how to submit because we did the same thing for the midterm. So I don't think we need to go into that in a lot of detail. If any of you are still struggling with how to zip folders, if you want to retry that again before you get to finishing the case and make sure that it works, you can do that. I know there were some people in the midterm that had problems with saving reports into PDF or exporting them or zipping files. So if you're one of those people and you haven't confirmed that you know how to do it yet, that is something you could stay on right now and we can test it out and make sure it works for you so that you don't have the same problem when you're submitting the case. And then of course the final, because the final exam is going to be very similar to this, where you're going to be submitting a bunch of files and a backup file, and then you're going to be zipping it and putting it into the final exam Dropbox. So the only difference for the final exam is that I still need to add the file for you, which as I said, I will do next Wednesday, because that gives you guys all plenty of time to finish the setup here, which is this case file that I'm sharing. And after that, you could start the final exam. So now I'll just stay online if you guys want to read through it. If you have any questions, stay on. Otherwise, you can log off. And I'm going to stop the recording.